This morning, my goal is to expand our thinking and deepen our awareness and challenge all of us to avoid oversimplification and reflect deeply on the profound mystery of life and death, the mystery of eternity and time. My purpose is not to change anybody's mind, not to ruin Easter by attacking your faith or sabotaging your skepticism, but rather to give you something to reflect on for the rest of the day. So we'll begin with a simple question. Have you ever dreamt about someone who has died? Someone who's no longer living? My guess is that most of us have. I see a couple of nods. So if someone is alive in your dream, if they're alive in your mind, are they not, in some sense, still alive? Are they really dead? Are they totally dead? Or are they, in some sense, both alive and not alive at the same time? I know that Reverend Ted Tollefson, who has spoken to many of you many more times than I heard him, but has a special interest and special training in dream work and taught a dream workshop here some years ago. I'm not a specialist on dreams, but as I reflect on this, if our dreams allow us to glimpse beyond our conscious minds into the deep recesses of the subconscious, then this can be a lens through which to understand various things about time and eternity, about life and death, and a lens through which to understand the stories that I'm going to share today. The author Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist who died earlier this year, talks about an understanding of death that is quite different from ours. We believe that when we are born, when out of being nothing we become something, and then life ends when we die and become nothing again. And so we are filled with the fear of annihilation. But we can see that birth and death are just notions. They're not real. He seems to be saying that it's a construct of our minds, just like time is a construct. Time itself doesn't really exist, but it's a human construct. But I'm aware that our time is limited and we have to be done at a certain time. The Buddha taught that there is no birth and no death. Our belief that these ideas about birth and death are real creates a powerful illusion that causes us a great deal of suffering. When we understand that we can't be destroyed, then we are liberated from fear. It's a huge relief. We can enjoy life and appreciate it in a new way. And then he goes on to speak personally. Thich Nhat Hanh says, "When I lost my mother, I suffered a lot. I grieved her death for more than a year. And then one night I was sleeping and I had a dream about my mother. I saw myself sitting with her and we were having a wonderful talk. She looked young and beautiful with her hair flowing down around her shoulders. It was so pleasant to sit and talk as if she had never died. When I woke up, I had a very strong feeling that I had never really lost my mother. The sense that my mother was still with me was very clear. I understood then that the idea of having lost my mother was just that, an idea. It was obvious in that moment that my mother was still alive in me and always would be." So we're pretty familiar with the idea that when someone dies, they still live on in our hearts. And I think no one would disagree with that. That's probably almost a universal human belief. You know, there's so many things that divide us, but maybe that's one thing that we can all agree on. Even Christians and Muslims and Jews and atheists and everybody. They live on in our hearts. And I agree with that too. But today I'd like to suggest that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And maybe they live on in other ways as well. Dr. Janice Amatuzio is a forensic pathologist, a person who does autopsies, practicing in the Twin Cities. I heard her speak several years ago when I lived in Minnesota. She has a gift for gaining the trust of her patients and their families and she has compiled stories in this book, Forever Hours. And she tells these amazing stories that have been shared with her, and some personal stories of her own. In one case, after investigating a death, she and the law enforcement people were going to lunch together, and one of them was familiar with her book and asked about it, and so she ended up talking a little bit about it, and then the sheriff who was there with them said that he wasn't afraid to die. He said, dying's not a big deal. I drowned once. He didn't say almost drowned. And so he was a man of few words, but someone asked him, well, you grew up on Clearwater Lake, didn't you? Yes, my brothers and I spent just about every day of the summer swimming there. We used to dive off the lifeguard tower and race to touch the bottom of the lake. And then he goes on to tell how they wanted to make it a little more competitive, so they would swim in and out of the rungs on the ladder. But they got narrower and narrower toward the top, and he got stuck in between a couple of those rungs and couldn't get down and couldn't get up. And so he was stuck there, and then he could see his brother getting to the top. I was almost out of air and I started to struggle. I couldn't go forward. I was really wedged. And I started to panic. My brother went and told the lifeguard that I hadn't come up yet, so they came down looking for me, pulled me out, threw me into a lifeboat, started mouth to mouth. I came to in the bottom of the boat. Darn lucky I did. I remember that I had swallowed a lot of water. I was coughing and choking and hurt to breathe. They took me to the shore, called my mother. My little brother was considered a hero, but I was grounded. And we never tried that competition again. Dr. Amatuzio asked quietly, Sheriff, how long were you out? Oh, they tell me it was at least 10 minutes or so. Didn't you get taken to the hospital or the ER? No, they just towed me on shore and made me lie down and called my mom. First she cried and then she grounded me for 2 weeks. Do you remember anything from the time you realized that you were stuck and couldn't get to the surface? And he suddenly looked down and, well, yes, but I usually don't talk about it. And the county attorney said, go ahead and tell us. What happens is as clear as it were yesterday. I remember looking up at the surface of the water just out of reach. I began to panic. As I struggled harder, I realized that I was out of breath. I remember thinking, what a dumb way to die. And I took a large gulp of water, and all of a sudden, the next thing I knew, I was up above my body looking down on it. There were beautiful colors everywhere. I felt sorry for my body, but it was strange. I wasn't worried about it. There was all sorts of activity going on frantically. The lifeguard and my brother and all sorts of people were there. I felt perfectly calm and found myself racing above the surface of the water, speeding along the surface. Really, it was fun. I could move by just thinking about it. I was surrounded by all these beautiful colors, and I was heading towards shore when all of a sudden I was jolted back into my body. I was on the bottom of the boat, face down. I remember the shock of being lost, and then I vomited. So he regained consciousness. Everything looked a little dull afterwards. You know, Doc, I know that you're the coroner and you see this stuff every day, and it bothers lots of folks. But I'm not afraid of death. Not after what happened to me. Dying is easy. It's living that counts. There's another story that comes from the setting of a hospital. But first I'll just mention too that there's also a lot of research about this. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's been discovered that in recent years, the research cross-cultural has discovered that 95% of the world's cultures are known to have some mention of near-death experiences. And there's percentages of how many people have experienced it and so on, but I won't go into that because the stories are actually more interesting. So this one is a little bit longer, about an older gentleman who was in the hospital, and Dr. Amatuzio came to him early in the morning when he needed to have some medicine. And he said, blood clots like to form in my legs and travel up to my lungs. The doctors think I have some clots in my legs now. Yes, I replied, that's why it's so important that you get this medication into your veins. 2 years ago, they put in a filter in my abdomen in the inferior vena cava to stop the clots from passing to my lungs. That's when I died. But you're here now. Yes, I came back to life. As unbelievable as it seemed, I felt a shiver go down my back. Well, the doctors had just finished the surgery, which took about 5 hours. I awoke in the post-anesthesia recovery room, and the nurses told me that it had gone well. But I remember having difficulty staying awake. The nurse kept squeezing my shoulder. It was the strangest thing that ever happened to me, doctor. All of a sudden, I left my body right through the top of my head. I found myself looking down on me, on my body, from the ceiling. I felt so sorry for my body. Suddenly, the doctors and nurses came rushing to my side and began resuscitation. I was puzzled because I was just fine. I could feel their concern, and what's more, I could read their thoughts. I went to the doctor's side, tapped him on the shoulder, but he didn't feel me, so I got right in front of him, and I said, "Stop all of that, I'm fine." He didn't hear me, but I could hear every thought that he had. One of the nurses was upset that she had to stay and help. I knew her thoughts. She was looking forward to a date right after work. "You mean that you could read every thought they had?" "Yes, it's strange, but it's almost like feeling every thought, like reading their minds." "What did you do then?" "I watched them working furiously on my body. They were using shock paddles. My body jumped every time the paddles were used. Then the man in the bed next to me had a cardiac arrest." "How do you know that?" "I watched it, the whole thing. His heart stopped pumping and he left his body too, right through the top of his head. And did he ever look surprised to see me?" I communicated with him by just thinking and told him what had happened. What happened next? We watched the confusion below us from some spot up near the ceiling. There was only one emergency cart and the doctor was shouting orders and calling for help. The shock paddles were on the emergency cart and the poor doctor would shock one body and then turn around and shock the other. There wasn't enough supplies because so much had already been used on me. Well, what did you do then? Well, it became clear to them that we couldn't communicate with them, and it seemed odd, but I didn't feel attached to my body. So we both left the room. How did you do that? Well, this sounds strange, but we just thought our way over to the hallway, and we didn't go through the doors. We went right through the wall. I remember seeing the waiting room near the operating room. There were still several people there, and I could feel their concern for the well-being of their loved ones. Then we moved on. To where? We left the building. We went right through the wall. I remember looking back at the red brick and mortar, and then we were outside. All was calm and still, but it seemed different, somehow warm. And then I saw, off in the distance, I felt the most amazing, beautiful light. It was so bright. It was made up of every color of the rainbow and more. I was instantly drawn to it, and so was my companion. As we approached this dazzling light, I felt the most incredible joy and awe and sense of grandeur I've ever experienced. Words don't do it justice. Then the light opened up into a cone or tunnel. I felt a rush as I moved through it. There were incredible colors there, some I had never seen before or since. I saw my mother and father, my dear aunt, and my dog. They were smiling at me, and it seemed like a joyful reunion, a celebration. I was filled with such happiness and anticipation. As I traveled upward toward the source of all this joy, I grew more aware. The brilliant, dazzling colors shimmered, and I began to realize, everything. I can't explain it. All at once, I remembered the purpose of my life. I understood how it all worked. I realized that it was all, somehow, perfect. I was overwhelmed and stunned by the loving kindness that surrounded me. I was still aware of my companion. He continued to accompany me. Suddenly it became clear that I could not stay, that I must return to my body. In that instant, I knew with crystal clarity the reasons why. And then my companion, the other man who left the recovery room with me, he got to go toward that dazzling light. I had to come back. We just sat there. Tears streamed down his face into his chest, but his eyes remained bright. I've never told the entire story to anyone. Thank you for telling me. The next thing I knew, I was back in my body. Everything hurt. I felt sick and was tired and hurt all over. But I was also amazed at what had just happened to me. Most of all, I remember the incredible peacefulness. It seemed as though truly nothing mattered. I was so overwhelmed that I just kept it all to myself and kept trying to remember all that had happened. He goes on to say that he tried to tell his doctor about the experience, and the doctor says, "You must have had an unusual reaction to the anesthetic and medication." No, it wasn't a reaction. It was the most real thing that has ever happened to me. The doctor said, "Listen here, you don't know what you're saying. You were dead and gone. We attempted resuscitation for over 15 minutes. Your heart was not pumping, and then bango, your heart started again, and here you are, alive and recovering." And then he goes on to tell about watching the whole thing and seeing the guy in the other bed, and the doctor said, "Well, somebody must have told you about it." But he insists that it all happened. And so, as they finished up this conversation, "How has this changed your life?" Dr. Amatuzio asked. "First, I don't fear death at all. I know that we do not die. The experience called dying that I had was the most magnificent thing that has ever happened to me. Second, I know that love is really all that counts, and that it is no consequence to store up or value material things. It is who we are that matters. And last, I try to learn something each day, to gather knowledge, and then try to apply it to make this world a better place." I had shared that story with my parents several years ago when I first read the book. And after that, my dad, who was a lifelong Lutheran and a traditional Christian with traditional beliefs, commented, "So it really doesn't matter what you believe." And I think in that sense, my dad had a glimpse of universalism without calling it that. But then last spring, when he was in his final illness and made the decision to stop the antibiotics which weren't working and go on comfort care, and he said, "I'm not afraid to die." So when one can have that sense of peace, it's a real blessing. As I was saying, there's research into these stories, and it actually goes way back. The oldest known medical report is from a French military doctor in the 18th century. And more recently, in the 19th century, there was a large study done in England by Henry Sidgwick, member of the Society for Psychical Research. And he had 400 volunteers working with him, probably students, who asked 17,000 people this question. They obviously were working with the educated class in England. Have you ever, when believing yourself to be completely awake, had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched by a living being or inanimate object, or hearing a voice, which impression, as far as you could discover, was not due to any external cause? And so these 17,000 people were asked that, and about 10% of them answered yes. And so then they were followed up with an interview. And the more recent research suggests that a lot of these so-called near-death experiences happen during anesthesia, perhaps up to 20%. There's also some interesting cross-cultural aspects of it. It's been suggested that sometimes the actual content of the dreams, or whatever you want to call these experiences, does seem to be influenced by the culture in which one is raised. However, there are some parallels that are found in all of them across cultures. And there's one study that analyzed the afterlife beliefs of 5 ancient civilizations and found similarities across time and place and culture that could not be explained by coincidence. And there's also stories from children, which would have less of an impact by the culture and the education since they were younger. And there's also, from the Buddhist tradition, the fact that some Buddhist meditators can willfully induce a near-death experience at a pre-planned point in time. And the Dalai Lama has asserted that experienced meditators can induce this state and be able to even sustain it. So there's lots of things that our modern science doesn't completely understand. We can try to explain it with physiological explanations like the oxygen deprivation in the brain or neurochemical changes in the brain due to stress, but they don't totally explain it away. So it's food for thought. A couple more stories are not quite as long. One of them has another humorous element. When this nurse told Dr. Amatuzio that early in her career she worked in a coronary care unit, was just arriving for her shift, and saw the cardiac monitor in a patient's room go suddenly from normal to ventricular fibrillation. She ran into the room and delivered a precordial thump, a forceful blow to the sternum, to shock or startle the heart back into normal rhythm. Resuscitative efforts were started, and the patient, a widow in her late 70s, was quickly stabilized. The nurse felt proud and pleased to have been of such service. Later in the evening, as her shift drew to a close, she decided to go back and check on the lady. She walked into the room and introduced herself, and the lady says, "Oh, so you're the one." "Yes, I saw the monitor and realized you had slipped into ventricular fibrillation. I ran into your room to help you." "Well, I must admit that I don't quite know if I should be thanking you or not."
No, dear.
"You see, I was having the most extraordinary dream. My dear husband, who died several years ago, was standing just above the bed." And she wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. "He put his hand out to me and I took it. And then he lifted me up right out of this bed. Gently he wrapped his arms around me and we began to dance. He always said he would save the last dance for me.
Oh.
We danced blissfully in each other's arms. That is until you hit me in the chest." I suppose a cynic could say, well, he should have sent a message ahead so she could have signed a do not resuscitate order. But that would have taken away the surprise element. So, one more story about a lady named Martha who was married to a pharmacist. And one day he was continuing to work and had home health aides caring for her. And they told him that Martha had asked for her robe and then quickly added, "My robe is not ready yet." I was somewhat puzzled. And then on the day just before Martha's death, one of her friends stopped to see her. Martha had become weaker and was telling all of us her vivid dreams and visions. She said with her eyes shining and wide that she had seen her robe, that it was white and gleamed and shimmered, and that she was at peace. She shared glimpses of her visions of angels and heaven, shimmering colors and joy. She was filled with ecstasy by what she saw. I know that she had no regrets about leaving or dying, and she just slipped into glory. "Mr. Nelson," I asked, "how has this affected your life?" I was so uplifted by what she experienced that at the funeral I was strangely joyful and sad. I was sad for me, but somehow thrilled at what I had been allowed to glimpse. I feel her with me often. I feel the comfort of her love. "Doctor, I don't feel that heaven is way up there somewhere. I feel it is right here, now, all around us. That Martha is right here. That heaven is right here. That God is right here. And knowing that has helped me live fully in the months since Martha died." I will close with a few lines from a poem by Mary Oliver. I'm grateful for the board member who sent this to me, entitled When Death Comes. When death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made my life something real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. May it not be so for us. May we also not end up simply having visited this world.